The reason finishing a good book feels like grief isn't because you're being dramatic or too sensitive. The people who told you to just get over it, or it's just a story, fundamentally misunderstand how your brain works. I remember finishing a book at about 2 a.m. on a work night, and I sat in bed with this hollow, achy feeling in my chest. The kind you get when someone you care about moves away or a relationship ends. I felt ridiculous, because I was genuinely sad about people who never existed, even though I knew they never existed, which somehow made it worse. But here's what I didn't understand at the time, and what most people get completely wrong about this experience. Your brain doesn't actually separate fictional relationships from real ones the way you think it does. When you spend hours or days with a character, your brain is doing the same work it does with real people. You're tracking their patterns, predicting their reactions, understanding their motives, and feeling what they feel. That's not passive. That's active empathy practice. Your brain is literally borrowing their perspective and trying it on, and the longer you read, the better you get at being them. So when the book ends, you don't just stop reading. You have to stop being that person. Your brain has to unlearn all that work, and that process feels like a loss, because, in a very real way, it is. You're losing access to a perspective that isn't yours, and if the book was good, that perspective probably gave you something your regular life doesn't. The thing that finally made this make sense to me was realizing that I felt different types of grief for different books. Some felt like a breakup. Some felt like leaving a place I'd never get to visit again. Some felt like saying goodbye to a version of myself I got to try out. And that difference matters because the common advice for dealing with this completely misses the point. People will tell you to just start another book immediately, like you're just addicted to reading and need your next fix. But that's the same logic as telling someone who just went through a breakup to immediately start dating someone new. You're not grieving the activity of reading. You're grieving the specific relationship you just lost, and jumping straight into another one doesn't actually address what you're feeling. Or they'll tell you that you're too emotionally invested in fiction, like you need to create more distance. But the ability to get that invested isn't a weakness. It's actually a pretty rare skill. Most people can't do it. They read and enjoy it, sure, but they're not transported. They're not living it. And research shows that people who experience high narrative transportation, which is what we're talking about here, tend to have higher empathy, better imagination, and stronger emotional intelligence in real relationships. So when someone tells you you're being too sensitive about a book, they're often really saying they don't have access to that level of emotional depth, and your reaction makes them uncomfortable, which isn't your problem to fix. Most people who feel this kind of book grief have been told their whole lives that they care too much, too invested in stories, too affected by movies, too emotional about things that don't matter. And after a while, you start to believe something's wrong with the way you process things. You start trying to feel less, engage less, care less. But here's what actually helped me, and what I think gets lost in all the discourse about whether this grief is valid or not. The grief isn't the problem. The grief is information. It's your brain telling you what it's hungry for. I noticed something strange after finishing books that left me with that hollow ache. I'd feel restless for days, not just sad, but like I needed to do something and didn't know what. And I'd try to fill it by finding another book, but that didn't work, because I wasn't actually craving to read. I was craving whatever that specific book gave me that my regular life wasn't providing. Like, I finished this book once about someone who completely reinvented their life and moved to a different country, and the grief I felt afterward wasn't about the character. It was about the fact that I'd spent a week living inside someone brave enough to burn everything down and start over, and now I was back to being someone scared to even change jobs. The book let me practice being brave, and finishing it meant I had to stop practicing. And that's when it clicked. The grief is showing you a gap, the specific flavor of what your mourning points directly to what you're missing. If you're grieving a fictional friendship, you're probably lonely for a real connection. If you're grieving a character's sense of purpose, you're probably feeling aimless in your own life. If you're grieving a character's sense of purpose, you're probably stuck in too much routine. At one point, I started keeping track of this. Not in a formal way, just mentally noting what I was actually sad about when I finished a book. The pattern was obvious. I was consistently drawn to stories about people with deep, loyal friendships, and I grieved when those stories ended. That was a pretty clear sign I needed to invest more in my actual relationships into two-star community. And this is where it gets practical. Understanding this changed how I read and how I processed finishing books. Instead of trying not to feel the grief or immediately distracting myself from it, I started treating it as useful feedback. When I finish a book now and feel that ache, I sit with it for a minute and ask what specifically I'm mourning. What did that character have, do, or feel that I want more of? Sometimes the answer is simple. I'm mourning a sense of adventure because my life has been too routine, and the fix is to plan a trip or even just drive somewhere new for the day. Sometimes it's deeper. I'm mourning a character who knew exactly what they were working toward because I've been drifting without clear goals, and that's a bigger thing to address. But even just knowing what the grief is pointing at makes it feel less pointless. The worst part of grieving a book isn't the sadness itself. It's the feeling that you're sad about nothing, that you're wasting emotional energy on something that doesn't matter. When you reframe it as your brain giving you valuable information about what you need, it stops feeling like a character flaw and starts feeling like self-awareness. Another thing that helped was realizing that not all book grief needs to be fixed or analyzed. Sometimes you just spend time with a story that was beautiful, devastating, or true, and your brain needs a minute to metabolize that. You're not obligated to turn every emotional experience into a lesson. Sometimes the grief is just the natural end of having been moved by something, and that's enough. One thing I'll mention, because this has come up for me and might resonate with you, is that there's a weird shame spiral that sometimes happens with this. You finish a book, feel sad, then feel stupid for feeling sad, then feel frustrated that you can't just enjoy stories without getting so affected. And suddenly you're 3 layers deep in feeling bad about feeling bad. If that's something you deal with, I put together some notes on breaking out of that specific pattern. It's less about the book grief itself and more about the meta-emotional stuff that follows, the whole why am I like this spiral. There's a link in the description if you want it, but the short version is that the shame is usually doing more damage than the original feeling ever could. Is the thing. The capacity to be moved by a story, to feel genuine grief over something that never happened, to invest so deeply in fictional lives that losing them hurts, that's not something to fix. That's the same capacity that lets you understand people in real life, imagine perspectives different from your own, and feel things deeply enough to actually be changed by them. Most people are walking around trying to feel less because feeling more seems inconvenient, overwhelming, or embarrassing. And sure, feeling deeply about a book you finished might seem trivial to someone else. But it's the same mechanism that lets you empathize with real people going through real things, and you can't selectively turn that off. You can't decide to only feel deeply about things that other people have deemed important enough. So the next time you finish a book and feel that grief, try this. Don't immediately look for the next book. Don't tell yourself you're being ridiculous. Just sit with it for a bit and ask what you're actually mourning. Let your brain tell you what it needs. And then, if you can, give yourself a little bit of that in real life. Maybe you're mourning a connection and you text a friend you haven't talked to in a while. Maybe you're mourning a purpose and you spend 20 minutes thinking about what you actually want to work toward. Maybe you're mourning an adventure and you break your routine in some small way. Grief doesn't mean you're broken, too sensitive, or that you need to read less. It means you're alive to your own needs, even when they show up in unexpected ways. And honestly, in a world where most people are completely disconnected from what they actually want and need, that's a pretty valuable thing to be good at. You're not dramatic for grieving a book. You're just paying attention to information most people miss. And that information, if you actually use it, will tell you more about what you need than almost anything else. The stories that move you are showing you what you're hungry for. Listen to that. Let yourself feel it, and then go find a little bit of it in your real life. Because the goal was never to stop caring. The goal is to care about the right things, in the right proportions, and to use that depth of feeling to build a life worth living. You already know how to feel deeply. Now you just need to point that capacity at things that can feel back.